session, conversation with Dr. Rola Dashti, Executive Secretary for the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rola. Dr. Rola is a leading Kuwaiti economist and a long-time champion of women's rights and gender equality. He is currently serving as a member of the Supreme Planning Council in Kuwait. From 2012 to 2014, she was Minister for Planning and Development and Minister of State for Parliamentary Affairs. Dr. Dashti played a pivotal role in advocating for the decree to allow Kuwaiti women to vote and run for parliamentary elections. And in May 2009, she with 3 other women became the first women to be elected to Kuwait's parliament. She has also held key positions in research and development institutions, such as the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, and worked for major local and international financial and development institutions, such as the National Bank of Kuwait and the World Bank. Dr. Dashti holds a doctorate degree in population dynamics from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a master's degree in economics and finance from California State University, Sacramento, and a Bachelor of Science in agricultural economics from California State University in Chico. Welcome, Dr. Rola. We actually thought that for a variation of the theme, that rather than asking Dr. Rola to give a presentation on her perspectives and views about development and policy in the wake of COVID-19 in the region, is to organize this through an interview. And the interviewer is Mr. Muhammad Ali Yassin, a well-recognized capital market specialist, and he's a Chief Strategy Officer and Client Relations since October 2018. And he has various roles and positions in the capital market business based in Abu Dhabi. And he's also a member of the Select Brokerage Committee nominated by the Emirates Security and Commodities, and is highly trusted authority and financial analyst of regional financial market for over 18 years, and is widely regarded as an opinion leader that is widely quoted by local and international media, besides social media networks on the MENA economic activity. So we do have a very competent and well-informed interviewer, and we look forward to an engaging and informative and illuminating conversation with a top economist and policymaker at the regional level. So, Muhammad Ali Yassin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Badawi, and thank you for the for ERF for hosting this and for inviting us. It's an honor for me to have the pleasure of be the interviewer opposite Dr. Rola. You introduced her very well, and she is very well known. And I think, looking and researching on some of the things that she participated in, she talked about, I think we're going to learn a lot from her going forward today, hopefully. Dr. Rola, welcome, and thank you for making the time for us in this conference.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for this elaborative introduction. I'm looking forward to engaging with all members of ERF.
Thank you. Dr. Rola, the title of this conference mostly is the COVID-19 and its effect on the GCC economies, and we've seen over those 2 days lots of papers and discussions about all sides of it, whether it is the economic or whether it is the social. And I will try to get some of those here, your point of view on those issues. We are in March. It's nearly a year since we really all believe that this COVID is a pandemic. It's not just a cold, and it hit all the economies in the world, and GCC was not any different. Instead of being projected as 2020 as a year of growth for the GDPs in the region, we found that we have contracted. Based on the IMF report of October last year, they're talking about 6%. They were expecting 6% contraction to the GDP. 2021 started, everybody was expecting this is a good recovery year, and the numbers for growth were expected to be in the range of 2.3. It may be revised now going forward because I think the recovery, we are still going through some lockdowns now as the vaccine is still being implemented more successfully in countries than others. Now, Dr. Rola, looking back at the year, what is your evaluation of the government's reactions in terms of fiscal and monetary support in the GCC? And who do you think has succeeded more than others?
Thank you, Mohammed. And I think it's important, maybe I'll come up, I heard a couple, when my time allowed me to hear some of the presenters during your 2 days forum. It's very interesting just to note is that one gainer, a positive gainer that I hope the governments of the GCC and the Arab regions to capitalize on is the starting of a building of trust between the citizens and the governments. But unfortunately, this is starting to erode. I mean, with the pandemic, it was the voice of the government, the ministers of health, and the people starting getting the confidence and getting information from that credibility is starting to erode. And this is, they gained it by the pandemic, but unfortunately, they did not capitalize on it. So we are losing one of a good gain that we needed to capitalize on. Now, I heard Daniel stating about the stimulus packages. I'll talk about the GCCs. There was an announcement of fiscal stimulus packages around $65 billion. It's almost around 5% of the GDP of the GCCs. Yes, and it's way below the global average of 17% or 18%. And some of it, the reasoning was because we didn't have to pay wages for the citizens who are majority of them employed in public sector. And this raises a question. The burden of that employment issue and the sustainability of that employment issue. But another thing that we failed, and I think the GCC failed in, is that the small SMEs that are going to be the engine for growth in the future were not addressed properly.
Correct.
Across the GCC regions. So they were left behind because they are small and because their voice is limited. So the governments have seen people, because the majority of the people are employed by the governments, so they thought that giving them the salaries and maintaining their standard of living by the salaries is fixing the problem, and you don't need to address the other elements of it and let the market addresses it by itself. And I think this is a big failure on the issue, because the SMEs, when you want to grow them, is not easy. But if they are there and you lose them, then this becomes a very big loss. It's not a business. It is the opportunities that is lost and the credibility that you want. So across the region, there were announcements here and there, okay? And some of it by private sectors, like in Kuwait, for example, the banking sector decided to postpone, delay the payments. And some private rentier development companies decided to reduce the rent for but it was private relationships, not as a government initiatives to take care of it. So here is acknowledging it, not acknowledging it. Health measures, I think the risk element is that the risk response and the emergency crisis response, it's not the only, is only salient to the GCC by themselves. I mean, there was learning as you go. the crisis management of the pandemic, but it's not only for, it's the global, they were learning as they go, because nobody get to see the intensity of the crisis. It's not a health crisis, it's a development crisis, it's an economic crisis, and then how to deal with this. So that balancing, and I said it's an investment in survival. We were in an investment in survival of investment in survival of human beings through the health issue, but investment in survival of businesses is another issue. We focused more in investment of survival of human beings and less on the investment of survival of the businesses, where both should have been at the same time into it. So there's no shining country to say, okay, here is a very exemplified. It's learning as you go along, but it's not was shining to say, okay, here we're addressing the issues from the economic side itself. And what it compounded it, as you've heard with Daniel and other speakers, is the drop in oil prices. The drop in oil prices when it came to become 25 and 50, it just created a crisis, because that was the concern of the fiscal budget and making sure the liquidity is available. You have the wealth, but the issue of the liquidity was extremely important at that time.
Yeah, Dr. Rola, I agree with many of what you said, but I think the plan was to save, if we talk GCC, was to save the banks first. So we saw the central banks move with lots of fiscal and monetary policy. They pumped money in some banks, like in Saudi and UAE. They've taken the stand of delaying the loans for 6 months, and they pushed it now till the first 6 months of 2021. So the feel was, let's protect the banks, let's protect the salaries of the public sector. And as you said, we lost a lot of the SMEs, and the private sector were left behind. And a lot of those SMEs, as you talked about, and I know it's subject close to your heart in other discussions, those SMEs, when they went to the banks for support, they didn't get the same kind of support that other institutions did, and that is true. However, we saw some steps, or like when you said about the oil prices, is like the VAT was increased. Do you think that was a smart move in Saudi, doubling the VAT, for example, in terms of to try to offset some of the shortages in the budget?
I don't. You see, these spontaneous reactions for a liquidity or fiscal crisis, I don't think these are sustainable ones and more effective ones. These are reactionary results, and I don't think policies needs to become reactionary instead of well-designed. And we have a more important issue, and it's a long-term issue. It's the fiscal sustainability, not only fiscal consolidations of a short term. Okay, the fiscal sustainability and the impact of it. So this is where I said COVID was a good signal of the dramatic need, the urgency to revisit this whole economic and social pact that is within the GCC. And this is where we say it's important. Now we're saying to recover forward better and not recover back better. We need the forward in terms of, we don't want the same systems. We don't want the same policies and quicker to regain back them. There is a need of restructure of adjustments. There is a need of a social pact discussion. And I think now the issue is not only reduction of subsidies and increase of creating more revenue. And I think we need to have a big serious talk in the GCC. Number one, inequality is on the rise in the GCC. The 10%, okay. The 10% owns 70% of the share of income. It's a big issue, especially when you start having a lower revenue coming up and the lower government expenditure and the reduction of that. This is a crisis. This is a call for, if you don't reduce the inequality level and look into it, middle class are shrinking. Correct. This is another thing. And I'm talking about even the middle class is a created middle class. We don't have a sustainable middle class. This middle class in the GCC region was a result of government expenditure and creating the middle class over the time by dispersing the oil funds through creating jobs, providing housing, health services, education. So we created these middle classes, which ended up becoming consumer of the wealth, but not a generator of the wealth. Now we need to make sure that the middle class in the region are generator of the wealth. You cannot keep that middle class consumer of the wealth. So have a stable social, stable societies. This is we need, and you cannot have this in a rising inequality. So there needs to have a revisiting of the whole social direction, the whole economic issues in the country to address core sustainability, stability of the region. And this goes across what could be a good, sound policy 50 years ago is not sustainable now. And you need to revisit them, and you need to create a middle class that is creator of wealth to sustain the economies. The second thing is very important. The GCC countries are investing in their human citizens, but investing in their capabilities. However, unfortunately, they're not creating opportunities. So the investment in capabilities without creating opportunities to utilize these capabilities, it's a call for disaster. It is a call for a social unrest. And here we start saying creation of jobs. And we're talking about work, not employment. So you're having GCC citizens that has been invested in, okay, looking for opportunities to invest in the capabilities that he has, but he doesn't find them. He ends up becoming employed by the public sector. And then you're wasting the resources that you invested in the capabilities of it. And more importantly, the citizens are looking for work. They're not looking for a job that gives them the $2,000 a month or $3,000 a month. They're looking for work. And creating work is key. And now we're talking about, in the region, we're talking about between 2.5 to 3 million jobs for citizens need to be created in the coming 10 years.
Dr.
These
Rola,
economies are not creating this.
Thank you for this. But do you think, you talk about this, are you addressing, you treat all GCC countries as the same? If I look into some examples, for example, in the UAE, we've seen now, the trip to Mars. So we've seen new businesses and new employment into new fields, into space. We've seen the nuclear reactors, and it's run by a lot of it by local, in addition to internationals. And Saudi Arabia opening up of the tourism sector and opening up of those many areas, those projects like Riyadh 2030, is ensuring there is employment for locals, their opportunities. So I think there are some governments are trying to do and address what you have. The question is, are they doing it fast enough to absorb what is graduating from maybe from the universities?
This is very important things. Yes, we do have some projects here and there. We're talking about policies that drives forward. If we're going into digital innovations, for example, or going into green technologies or circular economy, okay, we need to have a direction across, not a sample snapshots here and there. It's nice to have a space, but you need to make sure that also you create economies that generate jobs, not specific. Now we're talking about capital intensive jobs. Okay, so you're going into industries which are capital intensive. Fine, let's discuss where is this capital intensive so that you pick up the capabilities that you are creating. But then you have to have a downstream process for small businesses to shine. So it is an integrated approach, not a singularity approach into it, and the snapshots here and there. And the second thing is that when we're talking about which industries we wanted to go in, now the generator of the foreign currency is the oil exports, the majority of it. Now, if oil, as we're seeing, their share will go over time to practically negligible to the GDP, where on earth the GCC countries will get the foreign currency, the hard currency, the dollar, the euros? Where would it be if you don't invest in industries that generate for you, are export oriented, that be able to generate for you the foreign currency? Then the issue is becoming, where is these industries, not only to generate jobs, but also to ensure that these industries that I will be financing through in the transition, through the oil revenues and through the sovereign funds, are able not only to create jobs, but are also able to bring the foreign currency. Today, the GCC countries imports almost $500 billion annually on imports. Don't you need to bring the $500 billion minimum of foreign currency? So then we need to discuss and say, where is it? Expanding on the economy, which is creating a local currency, is a call also for disaster.
Fair point, Doctor. Fair point, Dr. Rola, but also we can take examples. For example, outside tourism is an industry where it can bring foreign currency. Manufacturing and exporting is important, and we've seen some kind of industries, maybe in Saudi, like petchems. But I agree. With time, the private sector or non-oil GDP should grow in order to offset the requirements of the country. And you raise very important points here, I think. But I think in terms of where we're trying to talk about the COVID and the effect on the GCC, if I continue there to say, where do you think, what are the labor market challenges going forward? I mean, here you talked about a lot of things about putting plans there. Do you think that we need a plan between the invest in the education to improve job creation and then do these jobs? How can we go about this? I'm sure you had these discussions, whether back in Kuwait when you were in the government or as you are now in your role in the UN.
Sure. You need to do them in parallel. There's no question the quality of education is extremely important. And if you adjust for quality of education in the Human Development Index that is recently produced, you will end up moving all the GCC countries from the middle, from high development, okay, to middle. So the quality adjustment is extremely important. The second thing is that positioning your citizens to be ready for the future of work is extremely important in areas where it is. But then you need to position them. But investing in this and improving your quality needs to be in parallel, creating the opportunities. So you need to do both at the same time so that the inflow of your citizen have an opportunity to capitalize on the opportunities you gave them, on the capabilities you built them by the opportunities. So this is a very important issue. And then it comes the future of work and the jobs that I need to have available in which industries. So if I decided to become in the service industries, which is it? If I want to become a touristic place, I want to become in a green technologies, where is it? People need to have their niches. Do I need to become an energy exporter, not an oil exporter? So we're an energy exporter, and then we see the renewable energies and where we have a niche in them and become an energy exporter as a country. Then if we're going into digital innovations, then we need to make sure that also cybersecurities, investments in these cybersecurities have to be there. So countries, each country in the GCC need not to compete with each other, but need to complement as a block complement each other in these types of niche markets that they can have to sustain their economies as we go along into it. Today, we have an estimate. The sovereign wealth funds and the oil income is only there for a transition as a catalyst for sustainable transition. If we stayed as we are, in 10 years, by 2030, the debt of the GCC countries will be around $1.2 trillion, which is almost 1/3 of the sovereign funds accumulated. Sustainability is not there. So we are buying time by using our wealth and some of the oil revenue, as long as the prices goes up, but as long as the prices are in the 45 or 70 is not going to be enough as we go along. And the danger of that is that debts are accumulating at a very high speed. Now we're talking about 575 in 2019. We're talking about by 2020, it's going to become around 2021, sorry, around $650, $700 billion. The speed is in the last 4 or 5 years. So the intensity of this accumulation is high. And I don't have a problem of borrowing. My concern is that where is this borrowing going? And now this borrowing is going for recurrent expenditure and paying back the debt servicing. And this becomes a call for another disaster. And you need to have this borrowing going to productive activities. And the productive activities that generate income, not the productive activities that doesn't generate income. So I don't borrow to have a capital expenditure to make a building that doesn't generate me for an income to spend $200 million on it, where I can have it at 100 million. So we need to ensure, so borrowing is good if it's invested right in the productive activities. And to invest it in the productive activities, you need to say where I'm going. So there is a lot of dialogue. And I think here becomes very important is the governance process. And this is where people needs to be in a dialogue. Society needs to engage. Needs to engage in its future, needs to engage in its social pact with the state. There is a big dialogue, and revisiting this whole social pact is extremely important, and revisiting. And this is where governance comes. This is where transparency has to come. This is where accountability has to come. This is where the freedom of discussion on the path of the country needs to be discussed. You cannot have it and shock people. People in the GCC cannot wake up one day and feel that the prosperity is a fragile prosperity. What we're having now at the GCC citizens is a fragile prosperity, and a very severe fragile prosperity. We cannot be like wake up one day and happens what happens as the Greek woke up one day and they found out they are bankrupt and they are in a disaster. I mean, there is a responsibility, and countries is forever. We come and go. So the planning is not, and this is where the problem, especially in democratic places like in Kuwait, where there is the voice of the parliament, it's a short-oriented. So policymakers see their planning according to their time horizon. I'm in 2-3 years in the ministry, 4 years, or as a parliamentarian. So I'll take policies as a short term, irrespective what I will keep for the next policymakers or the future generation. It's their problem, and I capitalize now. And this becomes a problem because what we are spending is not only the wealth we are generating. We are not generating the wealth so that we have the right to spend it. We are spending the wealth of us and the wealth of our future generation. And this balance of intergenerational issue is extremely important, because we don't have the right to spend it at the expense of the people that didn't have the voice yet.
Thanks, Dr. Yeah, I think this goes to the discussions that we hear about where in the Kuwaiti parliament, where they have not passed still the law, the debt law, in order for the government to borrow. I think that was one of the arguments there. But Dr. Rola, what you talked about borrowing, I mean, this is not a GCC issue. USA now has issued debt and borrowed more than 100% of its GDP. Everybody's borrowing now money, and they go and give it to checks to people to stay at home. So although I understand where you come from for the GCC, But it's very tough now to argue this when the whole world is doing the same thing, to come and say, oh no, but they're wrong. Everybody's saying, let's get over the negatives from the pandemic of COVID. Let people now sit home and they take the vaccine, and then we can think about how we get back the businesses. So there could be maybe an opportunity here for the governments in the GCC to say, fine, we've done our part now so far, and maybe they put a plan for the future coming forward. I hope they listen to many of what you say, and a lot of maybe think tanks are thinking and trying to take this forward. Dr. Badawi, I think we have Dr. Rola has raised.
Mohammed, can I say something? But
sure,
just
please. Sure.
The issue is that the US is pumping money to revive its economy. Okay, it's reviving the businesses that they don't want them to lose. What we are borrowing, aside from COVID, I mean, it's not 1 year. Since 2015 onward, we are in deficits. So we're keeping on borrowing. So it's not COVID came and we're borrowing because of COVID, and then we're borrowing this money for recurrent expenditure. It's 1 year. It's the habit. And this is where the concern is that next year, if we have a budget deficit, we're putting the stake of the citizens of this region on the demand of oil and practically on the economies of South Asia. So if they grew, we will tell them thank you very much because oil prices are going up. We cannot have the fate of a nation dependent on other economies and watch it. This cannot sustain. We were lucky for the last 40 years or 50 years, and we were accumulating these sovereign funds, but it's about time. With the fast movement of the renewable energy, the oil that we are based is not indefinite. So there is a call for a crisis. And I'll give an example. In 1970, to generate 1 watt of electricity from solar energy, it used to cost around $500. In 40 years time, or 50 years now we're talking about, it's coming to less than $1. Sure. So it's just a matter of time. It's efficiencies in these productions. And what's happening is that there is more efficiencies in these productions of these renewable energies, and our cost of production in oil is going up, while there is an efficiency of the renewable energies. So it's a matter of time. And now we're talking about renewable energies and talking about batteries and different things. It's our fate. Some people will say we're here for 2050, but it could be slower. And if technological advancement and things, then we're risking and not taking action. We cannot have the time to buy the time. And this is where it's extremely important. And this is where I say the middle income class needs to be a sustainable middle income class that is generating the wealth for the nation to make it sustainable. And this is where we need to say, if I'm going to the industries or whatever it is, our eye should be on the middle income class. How do I sustain it? How to make it strong, not to shrink? How to ensure that inequality is reduced so that the growth I'll be talking about is an inclusive growth for the citizens, and not creating capabilities and not utilizing the investments that we are putting in our citizens. So the issue of borrowing, but then the other thing, the US, okay, can print dollars, okay? We cannot print, okay, dirhams or dinars or stuff like that without creating a funds, because we, at the end of the day, our $500 billion import bill is
we're pegged.
But at the end of the day, even if you are not pegged, the issue is that they have the currency, they're printing it, they're control. Yani, you cannot compare who has the upper hand in printing the dollars. It doesn't matter to them, but to us, we cannot do this as we go along. So my caution is that is fine as long as it goes to productive activities. Correct. And not to the other things.
Salaries.
And this is what, yes, this is what my important thing to do.
Dr. Badawi, do you have any questions you want to take from there, or can we continue? I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Ustaz Muhammad Ali Yassin. We now have actually being introduced to very deep issues And perhaps maybe now we can open it up for maybe 3 questions or so for Dr. Rola, so that we give an opportunity to the audience to reflect upon what she has said. So the floor is open. Maybe we can get 3 questions and then we would ask you to respond.
You can take it, Dr. Ibrahim, or you want me to read some of them?
Any
There's some in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking at the, okay. So Mr. Ahmed Sayed is saying, currently there's a huge debate among policymakers and academics in the US following Biden's announcement of the 1.9 trillion stimulus package in terms of effectiveness and impact on inflation, as it might lead to tightening monetary policy due to higher inflation later on. Would the GCC economies have similar concerns? What is your take on that, Dr. Rola?
Okay, first, unfortunately, there is no debate. If there is a debate, it's only in one country or so. So on the spending and where is the stimulus packages? It's government direction on these stimulus packages, which I said it was around $68 billion, but it went not where it should be going to me. Now we don't hear where the government, I mean, the issue is now it's not this to stimulate the economy. How do I'm going to inject? This is not a discussion at the GCC. It's the discussion is that, okay, where's my revenues and where's my budget? And majority of my budget is recurrent budget. Almost 85% of the budget is a recurrent budget. So the talk is how I'm gonna get to balance my budget and where I'm gonna get it. And the talk is borrowing. And this is the debate. Fiscal discipline and fiscal sustainability is a key issue that needs to be discussed. But the issue is that the fiscal discipline and fiscal sustainability is not being discussed as society discussion. It's unfortunately not all GCC have this discussion. And unfortunately also in Kuwait, where this discussion is derooted in a different mechanism. As Parliament doesn't see the fate of a country that is not able to generate income, okay, where they're calling for more spending on various things, and the government is seeing that I'm limited in terms of revenue generation. So there is a discussion not on the sustainability as we go along, but is a discussion, it's a political discussion in Kuwait. The others are not a discussion of re-injecting and energizing the economy. GCC economies are practically energized by government spending more or less into it.
Okay. Another question here is, it's interesting. It's very short, but I think it was raised. Says, don't you think that investment in Saudi Arabia's tourism sector is really of no use? This is Dr. Seema Hadia.
I can only say invest. Somebody has to do the feasibility. Okay, it's you do invest in any sector, was it tourism or others, that you know that you reap the benefit of the investment. So if you're this is what I'm talking about. Investment, tourism brings hard currency. Fine. Do I have the investment that I'll be putting in, irrespective of how many billions? Am I gonna generate jobs? And I'm going to generate the revenues that I'm putting in or not. So it's a feasibility, and I haven't seen what the feasibilities in the Saudis have done versus other sectors. So it's an optimization. The issue is that people need to optimize on the sectors they want to use first, and then see where it is. And it's not only generation of the hard currency, also the generation of good quality future of jobs and quality of work to reap the benefit. So, and the other thing is that we need to make sure that these sectors that we create shouldn't be led by government spending and investments. We need to create opportunities so that the private investment is the sole investor in these sectors. So this is where the trick and the challenge is supposed to be, and the creativity is that not every sector that I'll decide to go in, government could be an incentivizer at a catalyst, but not is the punching and the investor. Government shouldn't, we're talking about economic activities. Government should not be an investor in economic activities. Government should be a facilitator and a supervisor on the economic activities into it. So the direction, this is where the role we need to bring the private sector in. And since we talked about the private sector, because currently the private sector is dependent like citizens on the states, and this cannot last. So if we are putting our eggs in the private sector as the energizer for growth and generation of jobs, so we need to make sure that we have also a solid private sector that brings the hard currency and create jobs so that they will be able also to pay taxes. So the notion of just saying, okay, the private sector is the partner with the state, is the generator of jobs, is the growth engine, just saying it like this doesn't work. Because we have a private sector which is dependent on states. So you need to also to reform this whole private sector and direct them in the right place and don't make them dependent on the state and state contracts.
Thank you, Dr. Rola. There's another question. It's very specific to UAE. I don't know if you can help with this. It says, why is the unemployment in the UAE sector stable? Even when the GDP goes down, it still continues to be in the range of 2.4, 2.5. I don't know if you have an answer to this question, Doctor.
It's just simple. Everybody is employed by the state. When you pick the state is so the bill is coming is irrespective of the GDP, because it's not the private sector who's generating the jobs, and the majority goes to the public sector. So the public sector is not insensitive to GDP. Practically, it's a social obligation of the state. Part of their distribution of oil wealth is by hiring the staff. So there's not that linkages like we have it. We see it in other countries where the private sector is the driving and it reflects with the economic growth.
Okay,
issues.
Dr. Rola, there's a question from Dr. Arfan. This is a subject I know is very close to your heart. He says, the question goes, as a pioneer of parliamentary movement in the GCC, how can these countries bridge the gender gap given the rooted culture and inherited social values?
There is a lot is being done, but there is much more to be done and at faster pace. I mean, now you will see the GCC, the best in gender gap, the best one scoring was UAE and Kuwait, and we rank globally 120, 122. You can see how much far away we are in, despite the fact we are among the top in the region, but it's still the gender gap. There is a lot. Female labor force participation is increasing in the region, which is good, but at the same time, they are penalized. Women are entering the education. Women, we're seeing them in the tertiary education. Tertiary education, there is increasing. The percentages of women in tertiary education is almost between 65 to 75, depending on the countries, but the majority is there. The issue is that this investment in these capabilities, are they gonna get the jobs? And the problem is here we get into between 75 to 85% of the people, of the citizens of the GCC who are looking for jobs, 75 to 85% of the unemployed are women. So there is a bias of job also hiring against women, and because of the limited numbers of jobs. So we have the investment, we have the capabilities, need women to participate. Women, but we're seeing the voices of women. We're seeing women are more engaged in becoming an entrepreneurs, which is a good sign for this. Women is engaging in activities that are non-traditional women activities. So they're going into the future of work sectors, but still it's a women issue, it becomes a male issue also, creating the opportunities for them. But the female labor force participation also in the region is going up. While it is, yes, it is way below the global averages. We are one of the lowest regions in the globe with female labor force participation, but it is increasing. Culture is changing. Culture is changing. Demand, the need for both female and male income in the household is driving a lot of cultural changes. for women to go and work because of the need and necessity of the livelihood and maintaining a standard of living. And especially, I'm saying the middle class is becoming squeezed. Okay. Yep. And when we're talking about, and this is what I'll have to say, is that when IMF, I'm hearing removing subsidies and moving this, you need to make sure that you're creating alternatives. You need to make sure if you want to maintain the standard of living and the prosperity, you need to create these opportunities that people, if you take away from them something, they have an opportunity to create the wealth so that they can maintain their standard of living. But you cannot rip them out of their wealth and you can't give them the opportunity. You're just calling for a lowering prosperity, lowering standard of living. And this is what we're seeing. And this is the crisis. And this is a call of disaster, just looking into a number and the accounting of the fiscal. And I just want to increase the revenues or reduce my public expenditure, and I reduce all these subsidies into it. At the end of the day, somebody have to pay the bill. Now the bill, a lot of it is the government. Now you're saying, okay, I'm gonna transfer the bill from the government to the households. Fine, but make sure that the households have opportunities to create the wealth and to bring income to sustain that. In the absence of this, you're calling for social unrest and social crisis. So you cannot do it by itself without looking into the whole picture and in a dynamic perspective of it. And it's not a balance sheet problem. And I know the IMF looks into the balance sheets and that's it. And irrespective of where is the dynamics, how it is. But I think policymakers in the region needs to look into the dynamics of the overall picture of it. Because at the end of the day, we want a sustained economies because we want a prosperous citizens. So at the end of the day, your eye is on the citizen. So if the citizen prosperity is the key issue and everything derives from that, and sustainable citizen prosperity is the key issue, and then you drive the economies to ensure that sustainability.
Thank you, Dr. Rola.
If I may, Ustaz Muhammad, let me,
please.
Because I don't see other questions here in the online. So let me see if anyone from the audience who are actually attending can see them and their names and faces. If anyone would like to ask a question. If not, I would like to abuse my vantage point, Your Excellency, and ask you two questions. One of them is, as you said, the subsidy is not really a program for the future, but then on the other hand, there have to be some alternatives. There is a lot of, as you know, a lot of discussion these days about universal basic income and the various experiments that have been done on this. How do you see the potential of the GCC economies or policymakers moving towards, and citizens moving towards a regime of universal basic income in lieu of subsidized government posts or government jobs, or subsidizing the private sector of nationals? That's one question. The second question is about development corridors. What are the prospects of development corridors that straddles border in order to support more effective policy of strategy of industrialization, not only within the GCC, but even between the GCC and other Arab countries. So this hopefully might be another additional question that might shed light on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. I think the issue of universal basic income, okay, and removing basic subsidies, my key issue is that these types of programs becomes entitlement. And if they become entitlement, then we need to make sure there's sustainability. This is extremely important. So it's their sustainability, and we need to decide the sustainability on the long run. Okay, you cannot have these types of programs for 5 years or 6 years, and then you say, okay, you know what, we need to revisit these programs because we don't have the money and stuff like that. So these types of programs, and this is where I think smart spending on the government fiscal budget is extremely important, because this becomes part of the smart spending. And where does it become allocation? And you're giving them, okay, I'm gonna have everything as a market based pricing, great, fine, and I'm compensating everybody to have a good standard of living. Can you sustain it? Now I can tell you, from 2010 till today, the per capita income in the in the GCC countries, okay, is declining, and it's going to continue declining. Okay, so the issue is that you want to restructure the pack. Okay, instead of I'm subsidizing, I'm going to give you the income. Whatever you want to restructure, make sure it's sustainable. This is number one to it. So that, and create, the second thing is that I think these types of programs should not create dependency. I think we need to create opportunities so people are able to create the wealth and not become dependency. In the interim, you want to have this as an interim measures for creating opportunities so that people do not use these social policies, social protection, social assistance, whatever you want to call it, should not become a dependent issue. You want them to become an uplifting systems, uplifting programs to move you to a higher in your standard of living. And with it, wherever the format is, sustainability is extremely important, shouldn't become independency, and it creating the opportunities, it goes. Now, in lieu with this, talking about industrialization, service sector or industrialization for economic activities as a diversification mechanism, fine. But what type of industrialization? Now you're going to go into space programs where do we have our niche in them? I said we need to become an energy exporters, not an oil exporters. Then if you're going into energy exporters, are we going into the biotechnology, energy intensive industries, where it is green technologies? Fine, these are industries, but a different thing. Are we going into a circular economy? These types of things, different countries have different niches on them. I do not have a problem on the issues of industrialization. I don't have a problem on the issues of looking into service sectors and picking up your niche in the service sector, whether fintech, technology, where you're going into digitalization innovations. But in talking about this, and I think there is extremely important issues that then which we haven't shed light on, is the water issue. The water security in the GCC, there need to be a dialogue in it. Because in the absence of water, the livelihood is at stake. And I think the GCC countries, not every country has to have a water security measures, but part of it is because they share the Gulf and they share different water. There need to be a dialogue on this. And a water security is extremely important. A water dialogue is extremely important because this is part of the livelihood. And importing water is going to end up becoming more expensive than the oil you're going to be producing. So, and this becomes water industries. We're going to go into the water management issues in water industry. Fine, let's make sure that we sustain our economies into it. So water is extremely important as an issue of livelihood. Okay, that is been taken for granted, and it is a call for urgency, and I think for all the GCC. The second thing is that I do agree into regional integration, and I think the GCC needs to continue at least the GCC regional integration project to start with, and then linking it to the Arab integration. We need to ensure that we are part of the global value chain. At least let's start to become part of the regional value chains in our process of transformation and the process of a transition. There's a lot of work that we need to do, and we need sequencing is extremely important, but we need to have the map, and we need to have a dialogue. It's extremely important. The map and the dialogue is extremely important. So we know where the sequences is, and we know the transition, how long it's going to take us, because the transition is going to take time. And then investing in the transition from our sovereign funds or from oil revenues, if they have surpluses or something, it becomes a fair. Even borrowing to go into the transition, and you know where the end of the line becomes an agreeable process. But now we are reactory. we react to process, but we cannot keep on reacting. Okay. And by the way, the talk of diversification and fiscal discipline, stuff like that. If tomorrow we have the oil prices hits 100, 105 or whatever it is, everybody forgets about this. And we'll go into the business as usual again.
We're always reactive. You're correct.
It doesn't work. Fate of nations is not reactivity. Fate of nations is cannot. And we do have a good examples of nations that were prosperous. Mozambique in the 70s were very prosperous. The dollar was $1 Mozambique. It used to be like $2, and now the dollar is now, I don't know how many, it's trillion or God knows what in Mozambique currency. So nations could be prosperous, and they fail. They fail because we don't take the actions now, and we just buy time. And this is maybe we're talking about our culture, stuff like that. Buying time is our culture. The future have better things. The future can resolve things, and I think it's about time. We can't have this going on as we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rola. You have been forthright, deep, and illuminating. And I think this conversation is really very important for us to build upon and do some much more structured research, perhaps on the political economy, social contract, industrial policy, and even macroeconomic policy, because the dollar peg itself is an issue that I think needs some discussion going forward as the economy become more digitized and so on. I know that you have given a lot, but I want to give another opportunity for the participants here. If anyone want to ask a question, Dr. Fatma.
Rola, I just want to thank you very much for this very rich presentation and discussion. We really enjoyed it, and you have added a lot to this conference. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to see you after this long time we haven't met. And I really enjoyed the discussion, and hopefully that we will keep inviting you and hearing your contribution, the excellent things that you're carrying. Good luck, inshallah. Thank you very much, and hope we'll see you very soon, inshallah.
Thank you for having me, Fatma. Thank you. I really enjoyed it also.
I actually have the opportunity to meet with Dr. Rola back in 2012 when she was a minister, and with Professor Paul Collier and our common friends, Big Abdul Majid, and she was speaking with the same rigor and enthusiasm about development planning in Kuwait as she's doing now about the entire region. So really, thank you so much for your time and for your very interesting and forthright ideas. And I would also like to thank Ustaz Muhammad Ali Yassin for very insightful questions. And thank you so much.